Gang. I am finally back with a new video on Trollbot Studios with your host, Trollbot.exe. Today I'm going to be taking an unusual journey. Today I'm going to be exploring African American churches. Quite the unusual subject, but it's a subject nonetheless. All I'm really going to cover is things you usually see in black churches. And I'm probably going to try to explain why. So, let's begin. Okay, one thing about black churches, and perhaps the most famous thing about them, yes, you're going to go inside and praise the Lord, but don't tell me you're not going to lose a pound or two. Because these services get wild at times. But I'll get to that part when I get there. Let's start at the beginning when you enter church. It's normal as far as I can recall. But at my church, the vast majority of the audience is at least 45, typically in their 60s and 70s. With one member being over 100. The congregation is smaller than usual, and that's probably because of our current preacher. The previous preacher, as I remember, drew in much larger crowds. Then again, some of our members go to church via Facebook. For a brief aside, how do I fit in? I work in the digital department focusing on live streaming, headed by a guy we'll call Ron. Me and him usually hang out, and we would often share Yu-Gi-Oh! Facts. Okay, let's get back to church. So the service would go on as normal. One thing I am grateful for is at least my church gets to the point. Other churches tend to not do that. One church I went to had like 5 choir sections in their service. One thing that's most consistent about black churches, and perhaps its most famous attribute, is the pastor, who tends to get loud, like he is an MC or something. And that's consistent things shown around all black churches. However, the audience reactions tend to vary. Since the audience at my church is small, it doesn't tend to get too crazy. And if it does, then extremely rarely. But at other churches, it tends to get wild. Like you would have like your 70-year-old grandma doing American Ninja Warrior moves. Old people hear church music and start hitting the Ginyu Force poses. Turns out, churches actually inspired club music, and I can see the influences. I very much see the influences. Yeah, you gotta see it to believe it. It's truly a sight to behold. And in addition to your feeble old cane-wielding grandma moving like a New York gangster hearing a drill beat, a church also gets loud. Like I heard one comment on a YouTube video refer to how she would go to her church, she is Caucasian, and then after exiting, she would sit on the curb and listen to the black church making noise from halfway across the block. And also there are dance breaks, if I can call them that. Actually, I think they're called praise breaks.
Jingle bell, I'm not going to hell.
So, another thing to note is black churches can tend to run over time. And that's seen in a lot of other churches, not really mine, but even then it doesn't happen too frequently. And often at black churches, we often get food afterwards. Yay! I know every big back in the audience started smiling. And sometimes we would hold after church events that can last for like 10 minutes to an hour and a half. From experience, I know. Now it's time for the origins. And my sources are, I literally just found this off of Wikipedia. So the reason why African American churches are the way they are is because back in the 1700s, slavery was happening. And the early African American churches were founded by freedmen. When slaves were exposed to Christianity, given it's the US, more specifically Protestantism, they incorporated their own African practices into Christianity, making the services the absolute mess we know and love today. And also, since there were very few places for enslaved black people to gather, churches were sponsors for community events, political gatherings, social activism, and stuff like that to get the community together. Even after slavery, during Reconstruction and segregation and all that stuff, yeah, that was still the case. Come on, I know y'all past history, so y'all know what was going on at the time. Out of these churches bred thinkers like Martin Luther King Jr. being the most famous out of all of them. So, the black church proved to produce results. And also due to its social activism heritage, I noticed that recently church services have gotten to have a tinge of political intrigue into it to stimulate audiences, especially after Donald J. Trump's resurgence to the presidency in the recent election. Also, fun fact, my elementary school was actually next to a church. In fact, it was actually built by members of that church. And it was run by the pastor's wife. The school is relatively new as it was built around like the 90s or 2000s. In contrast, the church is old. Like, it is a historic church and a pretty big building in the city I live in. Fun fact, when I showed some classmates, hey, this is where I used to go to school. They're like, oh, you went to school in the hood. Though I couldn't really tell. So seeing as I have enough time, I'll talk about my experience at that school. It was a pretty good experience. I met a lot of pretty good people there. And I have a lot of nostalgia for it. But one thing I will not miss about that school is every Monday we have to do chapel. And each grade would sing a song and do Bible verses. We'd have to rehearse them picture perfect. I do not miss doing that. The only sport they offered was swimming, in which we would go to a YMCA downtown and swim there. Fun fact, from I think K3 to first grade, there were around like 20 to 30 kids in my grade. In first grade, there has been like 15 kids. But from second through fifth grade, there were around 7 to 9 kids. And they all mostly stayed the same. Fourth and fifth grade were relatively smooth sailing. So that's all the details I can share about that school. So, I think that's the end of the video. Next time, I'm probably going to go back to doing anime reviews with Space Runaway Ideon. And by Ideon, I mean episodes 1 through 38 and the movie Be Invoked. So, like, subscribe, and comment down below. And in the meantime, later, fools.